Britain's MI6 may have become known worldwide through stories of spies embarking on exciting missions in exotic locations, but the reality isn't so glamorous. Officially called the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 is the foreign arm of the British Intelligence Service and has been active all over the world since its foundation during the First World War. Today, on A Day in History, we expose some of the most disturbing secrets from Britain's legendary intelligence service. In the early 2000s, historian Keith Jeffrey was given unprecedented access to the secret files of MI6 and wrote a history of the organization's early years. While much of the book discusses MI6's work against the Nazis during World War II, it also contained darker secrets that show a more sinister side. One of the most disturbing showed MI6's actions surrounding the establishment of the State of Israel in the late 1940s. The region was under British rule, but they were willing to establish a new Jewish state for a displaced Jewish population following the Holocaust. However, the British government was concerned to balance the concerns of the local Arab population who strongly opposed the new state. The British decided to limit the rate of Jewish immigration to slow down the process, but the solution only angered both sides. A string of terrorist attacks from pro- and anti-Zionist factions struck civilians and British officials in the late 1940s. Meanwhile, thousands of European Jews were fleeing Europe for a new start after the horrors of the Holocaust, and the British struggled to stem the tide. With tensions rising rapidly, the British government turned to MI6 for a solution. MI6 knew it had to slow the flow of illegal immigrants. Its solution was intimidation. If refugees were too scared to make the journey, that might solve the problem. Documents show that the MI6 acknowledged that intimidation is only likely to be effective if some of the people to be intimidated actually suffer unpleasant consequences. MI6 proposed staging attacks on refugee ships. They floated the idea of tampering with water or food, or setting fires on board. But eventually, they decided that simple sabotage was the best option. In February 1947, MI6's plan was approved, with one condition: they could not directly harm any refugees. So, Operation Embarrass was born. Embarrass was top secret, and the handful of people who knew about it were ironically dubbed the Embarrassed. Taking advantage of the massive amount of munitions lingering in Europe following the war, MI6 managed to smuggle piles of explosives into Italy, where most of the refugee ships were sailing from. In 1947, MI6 attempted 5 attacks on large refugee ships. One was sunk wholesale, and 2 more were damaged beyond repair. The other 2 sets of explosives were discovered, but the panic from their discovery was considered by MI6 to have been just as useful as the successful sinking. To further convince the public of the danger, MI6 invented an imaginary terrorist group called the Defenders of Arab Palestine, who claimed responsibility for the attacks. Given the obvious tension between Jews and Palestinian Arabs, this story was easily believed. In fact, when the 2 failed sabotage attempts were discovered, the authorities noticed that the explosives were British, but they simply assumed that the Arabs must have stolen them from the British. So convinced were they that the Arabs were behind everything. Operation Embarrass was ended in 1948. It was considered to have been a success. The attacks had almost entirely stopped the flow of refugee ships from Italy, effectively solving the illegal immigration policy for the remainder of the time of British control of Palestine. Still, the terrorist attacks inflamed tensions between Jews and Arabs that only got worse after the establishment of Israel, and of course continue to this day. That MI6 committed such risky attacks and invented entire terrorist networks to cover for them has made people wonder what else they have done, and whether other supposed terrorist groups aren't quite what they appear to be. This was far from the only time MI6 meddled in the Middle East. In 2020, the transcript of a 1985 interview with the MI6 spy Norman Derbyshire was finally published. Derbyshire had overseen British intelligence operations in Iran in the early 1950s. It had long been known that MI6 and the CIA had a hand in the 1953 Iranian coup, but this interview gave new details that showed how deep that involvement went. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran. He implemented numerous social and political reforms that in the early days of the Cold War were viewed by the West as being a little too communistic. The greatest controversy came when his government nationalized the oil industry, seizing control of facilities and supplies from the mostly British companies that owned them. The Iranians argued they were taking control of their country, while the British saw it as theft and a step towards communism. The British were furious, and MI6 was quickly set to work gathering intelligence on Mossadegh's government and planning a response. The British soon became convinced that a full-blown coup was the only way to stop Mossadegh. They approached the Americans for help soon after, but Washington declined. Meanwhile, the British government escalated its public response to the crisis by blockading Iran with the Royal Navy and demanding the return of stolen British oil assets. With a full-blown coup out of reach, MI6 did what it could to nudge Iranian democracy in a favorable direction. They launched a sweeping bribery campaign ahead of the 1952 election that boosted Mossadegh's enemies across the country, but failed to curtail Mossadegh's plans. Mossadegh's policies did earn him the support of Iran's communist factions. Soon, the communists were marching and protesting in support of Mossadegh, seemingly proving Britain's accusations that Mossadegh was turning red. In 1953, the new Eisenhower administration finally agreed to work with MI6 to deal with him. Together, the CIA and MI6 launched Operation Ajax to encourage a coup against Mossadegh. Mossadegh's actions only encouraged the British and American governments. Following an economic downturn and political polarization, Mossadegh had become increasingly authoritarian. He imprisoned dozens of politician opponents and cracked down on protests. In 1952, he held a referendum to dissolve parliament and effectively give himself dictatorial powers. Supposedly, 99% of people voted to support him, but by then, Mossadegh's police and thugs were intimidating voters, and anyone who wanted to vote against him had to do so in a separate location that made them obvious targets. MI6 and the CIA were no angels either. Their operatives harassed politicians and religious leaders who supported the government and began paying gangs of thugs to cause havoc in Iran's streets. Estimates say over 300 people died in violence in Iran, many of them in riots sparked by MI6 and CIA intervention. In April 1953, MI6 orchestrated the kidnapping and assassination of Mossadegh's chief of police, Mahmoud Afshartoo, crippling the government's ability to respond to the mounting crisis. Eventually, Mossadegh's government was deposed by his enemies, and the Shah was placed into power. Today, most historians believe that the final push to topple Mossadegh wasn't the work of MI6 or the CIA, but they did contribute to the conditions that undermined the regime. Hundreds died in violence provoked by MI6 and the CIA, and the whole idea of getting involved had been an MI6 idea from the start. The Shah would be overthrown in 1979 and replaced with a modern Islamic Republic of Iran. To this day, the Iranian government holds Britain and America responsible for the coup, and tensions between the countries run high. Another country where MI6 isn't held in high regard is Iraq. Britain was a sharp critic of Saddam's regime before the 2003 invasion and played a critical role in promoting the claim that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. However, agents involved with MI6 have revealed that the agency seems to have had its eyes on war long before the smoking gun evidence emerged that finally sent coalition forces in. In December 2003, leaks revealed that MI6 had been running a global propaganda campaign called Operation Mass Appeal to drum up hostility to Saddam's regime for years. Their goal was to make, quote, selective use of intelligence that would legitimize sanctions and military actions against Iraq. They wanted to turn public opinion against Iraq and create support for an invasion. This included propagating the dubious, unverified, and ultimately false claims that Iraq was making WMDs. MI6 propagandized the British public, but it also targeted other key countries, especially those who sat on the UN Security Council, hoping to persuade them to take a harder line on Iraq, such as India, South Africa, and Poland. Of course, the British did not work alone on this. For more on how their American counterparts acted in the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq, check out our video on US government secrets. But of all the scandals around MI6's work in the Middle East, it is Afghanistan that has come back to bite the most. These days, it is well known that Western governments, especially the US and UK, funneled money, munitions, and training to the Mujahideen fighters, who resisted the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan from 1979. MI6 was the leading agency involved in British operations in Afghanistan through the conflict. Thatcher's government immediately authorized MI6 to intervene and work closely with the CIA and Pakistan's ISI as part of Cold War anti-communist strategy. MI6 quickly identified Ahmad Shah Massoud, a militant leader whose work in the Panjshir Valley had proven to be remarkably effective at undermining Soviet and Afghan communist forces. They established contact with him in early 1990, and soon they provided training and essential supplies, most notably radio equipment to the militants. Before long, MI6 was helping to smuggle in SAS operatives for advanced training, and reports suggest that MI6 agents were sometimes directly involved in strikes on Soviet forces. It was a dangerous game. The discovery of British involvement could have had dire diplomatic consequences, and there were several close calls. MI6 was also involved in the CIA's larger Operation Cyclone, which tried to arm other factions of the Mujahideen. Hundreds of thousands of British weapons, from missile launchers to combat rifles, poured into Afghanistan and ensured that the Mujahideen had the firepower to match the USSR. Once again, MI6 played a vital role in training the guerrillas, sometimes directly, or by bringing in special forces veterans, mercenaries, or private security firms. They also became involved in direct attacks on Soviet assets. MI6 operatives were supposedly involved in guerrilla raids and explosive strikes in the Soviet republics of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They also supplied Pakistan with explosives that were used to destroy Soviet shipping along Uzbekistan's rivers. However, the Mujahideen were a wide coalition, and many of the factions hated each other as much as they hated the Soviets. MI6 tried its best to reconcile the groups, but by the time the Soviets withdrew in 1989, they had made little progress in uniting the disparate guerrilla forces. With Soviet withdrawal, MI6's interest dried up, and they soon abandoned all operations in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, there was no way to take back the weapons and training given to the militant groups. Shortly after the invaders left, the Mujahideen turned those weapons on each other. Bitter civil conflict gripped Afghanistan throughout the 1990s, and from this chaos, the Taliban emerged from some of the old militant groups. MI6's old ally Ahmad Shah Massoud proved to be a reliable anti-Taliban fighter, but his assassination on 9th of September 2001 ended any hopes of stopping the Taliban. 2 days later, the 9/11 attacks ushered in cooperation with their American allies. When some MI6 staff complained to their superiors, leaked responses from MI6's leadership shows that they were told to turn a blind eye to it. When the torture was done under American leadership, MI6's position was that it wasn't their problem, and their agents had no responsibility to step in. In other cases, MI6 caused controversy by handing prisoners over to places they knew would torture them, even though this violated human rights laws. For example, in 2004, MI6 passed information to the CIA and Libyan government that led to the arrest of the Al-Qaeda-linked Abdel Hakim Belhaj and his pregnant wife. Both were tortured by the Libyan government, with Belhaj spending 6 years in captivity. Belhaj was eventually released and played a key role in the Libyan civil war. He eventually tried to sue the British government for its involvement in his capture, but his case was thrown out and his appeals rejected. The question of torture during the War on Terror follows the CIA too. For more details on the CIA's similar use of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, check out our recent video on the CIA. Belhaj was not an innocent man. Many people point out that he had links to deadly terrorist groups, and some people believe he deserved everything he got. Others insist that human rights laws should not be bent for anyone, or else how can we claim to be better than terrorists? Whatever you believe, it's clear that the world isn't black and white. Despite most of us getting to know MI6 through tales of heroic figures like James Bond triumphing over evil villains while keeping their honor intact, the real world isn't so simple. The work of MI6 has been complicated and controversial, and with so much material still hidden in classified archives, there's sure to be plenty of secrets yet to be found. We hope you're not too shaken or stirred about the secrets in this video. If you enjoy content like this, don't forget to drop a like and consider subscribing to keep up with our own intelligence gathering operations.